Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmiri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Viewers can ask questions by using the chat button on the right-hand side of the screen. We'll try to get as many of your questions as time allows. As a reminder, Polaris-Live.com is a commercial-free, viewer-supported channel. You can help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel and newsletters at kashmiri.com. The European Union has largely adopted the US-driven get tough approach against China with limits on commercial cooperation with that vast country. But the EU, the European Union, faces its own international issues, led by the Russia-Ukraine war on its doorstep. And will its US-style commercial and security strategy let it get outflanked as the US-China rift melts, as it now seems to be rapidly doing? Can the EU really have its own foreign and trade policy? Important questions about America's closest allies in the EU. To help us make some sense of the EU-China-U.S. triangle, we have as my guest today Professor Nicolas Michelon. Nicolas is a partner at Confluence Consultants, a geopolitical risk and business intelligence consultancy in Dubai, and the founder and editor of AsiaPowerWatch.com. He advises corporate executives on how to navigate the current geopolitical and geoeconomic environment, mitigate risk, and develop prospective scenarios. He is also an adjunct professor of geopolitics, geoeconomics of the Indo-Pacific, and business intelligence at ESCP Business School, EM Lyon, École de Guerre Économique, Paris School of Economic Warfare, and the International University of Monaco. Good morning and welcome to Polaris Live, Professor Michelon.
Hello, Sarah. Thank you for having me.
How are you today? You're coming to us from Paris. Is the weather pretty good?
Typical autumn weather, but that's
fine. So let me ask you to start with Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, recently urged Europe to be pragmatic and rational in its China ties. What was he talking about?
Well, the idea behind this almost injunction by Foreign Minister Wang Yi is to try and create a rift, create a disconnect between the EU and the US. The idea for China is to try to maximize the possibility that the EU will not be forming a common front together with the United States when it comes to dealing with China. China is basically capitalizing very clearly on there's no other way to call it, the complete confusion that reigns in Europe when it comes to getting a clear idea and a clear strategy on how to deal with China. One very good example and probably one phrase that illustrates best this total confusion came from a French foreign minister, not the current one, the previous one, when he labeled China a partner, a competitor, and an adversary. So which one is it? Is it a partner or an adversary? Is it a competitor or an adversary? The confusion is total. It's particularly true in Brussels at the supranational level of the EU administration. And it is for a very simple reason, is that European power typically used to rely on two main pillars, being France and Germany, in terms of policy making, in terms of economic power. This is not true anymore. It is basically relying very concretely, and this was made very apparent right after the beginning of the Russian military operation in Ukraine. It's relying almost solely now on the German pillar. A researcher from a German-based research center called Mercator Research Institute on China Studies, famously summarized the situation. He was asked, when it comes to a common China policy, what is the problem in Europe, in the EU? His answer was, the weak link is Germany. Within Germany, it's the automobile industry. Within the automobile industry is Volkswagen. I would add Daimler. I would add now, outside of the automobile industry, BASF. It is an open secret now that BASF of Germany is basically making Germany's foreign policy. You have companies in Germany that are so dependent on the Chinese market that they are lobbying extremely aggressively Brussels to not go down the American route, to not go into confrontation mode with China, because they are depending way too much on this market. I'll give you one very good example of this type of dependence. Our listeners may know that in China, like in many other countries, the proceedings of the National People's Assembly is broadcasted on TV. And a friend of mine called me one day. He said, Nicolas, you should be aware that I'm looking at my TV right now. I'm going to look at the proceedings of the National People's Congress in China. They are putting some TV commercials, and the TV commercial just before the show starts, it's a commercial by Daimler. And there is a voice that says, this program of national interest is brought to you by Daimler. Okay, so there you have a German car manufacturer actually sponsoring the broadcasting of the National People's Congress proceedings in China.
Which, Nicolas, reminds me, I wanted to ask you that partly in response, I think, to the foreign minister, President Macron of France, said Paris has no intention of limiting China's growth. But that's not the approach Brussels, right? The EU center of gravity seems to have adopted. So based on what you're saying and what the foreign minister and Macron have said, is there a cleavage opening up between Brussels and Germany and France?
Absolutely. As I said, there is absolutely no common front. There's no coherence in the way this China policy is being put forth throughout Europe. We've seen that in Italy, for example, prior to the government of Meloni, Italy had joined the Belt and Road Initiative proposed by China. Now Meloni is trying to put Italy out of it. There is absolutely no coherence. With governments coming and going, there is every time a change in China policy. And then there are opposite interests depending on the European countries. I would argue that the only countries that have sent a very clear and consistent message are those European Union members from Central and Eastern Europe, the likes of Poland, the likes of the Czech Republic, the likes of most of the Baltics. They are sending a very clear message because they are very clearly Atlantist in that respect. So they are very harsh on China. They are, they condemn. They participate actively in sanctions against Chinese officials when the discussion happens in Europe. But in Western Europe, I mean, it's every man for himself, and a lot of very aggressive pro-China lobbying on the part of a very few but extremely powerful German companies.
But Nicolas, this has been a perennial issue within the EU, hasn't it? I mean, you know me now for some time, and you couldn't find an American who thinks more highly of the EU and what the seminal change that was for Europe. But the idea of a common budget and a common foreign policy is something that has escaped the EU ever since it was formed. So, why is this surprising to you that it now is rising when there are so many tectonic plates like Ukraine and so on?
It's not even surprising to me. It's becoming apparent now that Europe is built on a very shaky ground of
Hmm.
totally divergent economic interests, totally divergent economic realities. It was not apparent before because Europe was still in a reconstruction phase after the Second World War. But already, when you pay attention, you look at the first oil shocks of 73 and 1979, you start seeing a divergence between French and German economic interests. And that divergence has kept getting bigger and bigger to the point where now Germany and France are actually in full confrontation with one another over China policy, over the green taxonomy in terms of energy transition, over the use of nuclear energy. I mean, if if there is one thing that the war in Ukraine has taught us is that we are completely dependent on our energy for our energy on Russia. There is one alternative. There is one green alternative that ticks all the boxes of the ESG standards that we want to impose to ourselves in Europe, which is nuclear energy. But because France has a leadership in that technology and Germany has not, Germany is fighting for nuclear energy not to be part of the green taxonomy of the EU. So they are looking for, they're looking every which way to avoid going back to nuclear. They're increasing solar, wind. But I mean, last time I checked, solar and wind, it increases our dependency on China because it requires critical raw materials that only China has or that China controls. Most of the actual solar panels and the wind turbines are actually manufactured in China. So it still doesn't answer that question of how do we rebuild some form of strategic autonomy for energy, for example. And I could go on. It's the same with defense. It's the same with the automobile industry, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, it's interesting, and you remind me that there is also a cleavage within countries, like in Germany, for example, Daimler is not as vociferous about talking raise sanctions against China because most of Daimler's exports to China are made in China, whereas Porsche does not make in China. So there seems to be, am I right, a certain cleavage
Absolutely.
between companies within a country.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an excellent example. Within the automobile industry, you can see major differences depending on the level of market shares they have in China and whether or not they do manufacture in China. And this is how China, keeps them on a leash, so to speak. Let me give you one example of how far and how nasty it can get. When Lithuania proposed to Taiwan to open a trade office in Vilnius. Of course, China was furious about this. What did China do? First of all, they removed Lithuania from their free trade list. They had a list of not free trade, sorry, a custom clearance list. So they removed them temporarily just as punishment. But more importantly and more interestingly, China started applying pressure on Germany and German companies. On what ground? You, for example, Continental, the German tire maker, Continental, you have many suppliers in Lithuania and you sell mostly to China. So you will tell Lithuania to stop this madness.
Wow.
So China was weaponizing Germany against the decision made, a sovereign decision made by Lithuania. And what did you think happened? Continental went to Berlin lobbying the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Can we do something? Can we tell the Lithuanians to stop this? Because we're going to get killed. We're going to get killed on the China market.
There's power politics for you. But Nicolas Michelon, as people have often said, the business of America is business. And what I wanted to ask you is America's commercial ties with China are rapidly thawing, getting better. For example, America will send the largest delegation ever to the big import show in China that takes place in November, right? We're still running the largest amount of business with China from the heartland of America, farmers, chicken growers, and so on. And I may be wrong, but I think that this thaw will accelerate between America and China. We'll see if President Xi Jinping and President Biden meet at the APEC meeting in San Francisco 2 weeks from now. But what I wanted to ask you is, do you think Europe, the EU, risks getting outflanked and all of a sudden America's commercial relationship with China thaws, is getting bigger, getting better, and then here's Europe trying to follow the American get tough policy? Do you think there's any risk of that happening?
More than a risk. I'm actually seeing it happening as we speak.
Really?
Europe is basically late by at least one train every time. And I'm kind by saying at least one. I think on certain issues, it's like more 5 or 6 trains late. And it is a great paradox that the United States is the most vocal and the most openly aggressive towards China. But at the same time, as you very rightly said, the economic realities and the business realities are not going to be sacrificed on the altar of the political opposition. Whereas in Europe, especially in Brussels, they are willing to sacrifice business interests to a certain extent to stick to the American scenario on China, which is creating a lot of tension internally, as we've discussed previously, because many companies are saying, I mean, this is madness. This is totally suicidal. We should not be following the game plan that the US is trying to impose. And by the way, as you pointed out, the US is being very hypocritical about this because indeed business connections keep increasing, and we are actually seeing in a certain way a reversal of what we saw at the end of the Trump administration and the beginning of the Biden administration in terms of toughening relations between the two countries. So now, so the question is, can Europe basically at one point stop following someone else's game plan? And can Europe come up with its own game plan that plays in the favor of its own strategic interests? And that's the main question. And this is the question that is being asked to all Europeans every time when there is a European Parliament election. Who are we going to vote for next time? Are we going to vote for leaders who defend someone else's interests? Or are we going to finally vote for leaders who work very hard at European interests? The whole way that the relationship with Russia has been managed prior to Ukraine, to the Ukraine war, is in a way completely suicidal for Europe. It is understandable that the US managed it the way they did. Geography matters. Russia is our neighbor, whether we like it or not. They're not going to move elsewhere. For the US, it's different. They have an ocean on each side to protect them. They have distance. We don't have that, which means we have an energy dependency that is a reality, a sad reality, but a reality nevertheless. We have to look at the alternatives. The alternative is Algeria for gas, a country with which we have a very bad relationship for obvious historical reasons. The alternative is Qatar, which is a problematic country. I believe we're going to be talking a little bit about Israel-Palestine later. Qatar it's a challenge. Let me put it that way for Europe, in the sense that they keep financing radical Islam in many parts of Europe. An alternative is Azerbaijan, but a country like France used to be a strategic ally of Armenia, which means now, because we need energy from Azerbaijan, we have to change the nature of our diplomacy towards Armenia. So what I'm trying to say here is that we are letting events driven by other powers decide what our policy will be. And this is weakening Europe, and this is making Europe more and more irrelevant.
Well, let me take a moment to remind our viewers that Polaris-Live.com is a commercial-free, viewer-supported channel You can help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel and newsletter at kashmiri.com. And let's get back now to our guest, Professor Nicolas Michelon. Professor Michelon, let me ask you, the world's central banks have been buying an inordinately large amount of gold this year. China's central bank has led the other central bank and bought the largest amount amongst the central banks. Some analysts say this is partly the result of watching the U.S. weaponize the dollar with sanctions on Russia for its invasion on Ukraine, which gets us back to the de-dollarization issue that you and I talked about before. Do you think that there is still a movement to de-dollarize commercial transactions as much as possible? I mean, the dollar is so huge that you can't just replace the dollar with any other currency at this point. But do you see a resurgence of this de-dollarization move?
What I'm interested in, Sawar, is identifying the narratives, identifying the strategic interests behind the narratives. I think we will all agree. I'm an economist. I'm a macroeconomist by trade. I started my career as a macroeconomist. So I can indeed confirm that de-dollarizing an economy, any economy for that matter, will take a lot of time. It will be extremely painful. I mean, your entire banking system needs to reorganize. All your exporting companies need to reorganize. It is a messy business. So indeed, I do not believe that, for example, a BRICS currency is about to happen. No. But I think, and let's stick to this example of the BRICS currency because it falls into that narrative of de-dollarization. I think the beauty of this idea of a BRICS currency, it's a white elephant, obviously. But white elephants are useful because it's like this very crazy target that there's very little chance that you can reach that target. But at least it shows a direction. You have your eyes fixed in that direction. You'll be happy if you go just halfway. And halfway is a fairly large level of de-dollarization. It has started. As you very rightly said, central banks across the globe are diversifying their assets away from the US dollar and away from US debt to gold. It's not only as a result of the United States weaponizing the US dollar in sanctions. It is a big part of it, but another part of the rationale is the geopolitical uncertainty. And if you look in any times of a major geopolitical uncertainty, there's always massive spikes in gold buying because it's considered as a more secure asset. But indeed, part of the rationale is also that those countries, and here we're talking about mostly countries of the so-called global south, typically BRICS or BRICS Plus after the expansion that was announced at the latest summit in Johannesburg, and there will be more waves of expansion. Those countries are interested in freeing themselves from the long arm of the US Department of Justice, using the US dollar as a way to sanction countries and sanction companies. And here I'm talking about companies in particular. I advise a lot of clients on how to cope with such a thing as the FCPA, the Foreign Corruption Practices Act in the US, which is America's most potent weapon of economic warfare on the companies of its own allies, because the US uses FCPA mostly on European companies, by far mostly on European companies. So the idea is to use the US dollar as a weapon, of course, on the moral grounds that corruption is not nice. It should not be done. And countries in the global south, and especially under pressure from their own companies, are trying to get away from this, to escape from this. Imagine what the possibility of selling your oil in Indian rupee and how much it can be attractive to a country like Iran, for example. It has started between India and the UAE. The United Arab Emirates have already started selling oil to India and being paid in Indian rupees. It's becoming an extremely interesting proposition because part of your commerce, part of your trade now is outside of the scope of US imposed sanctions.
But
And the problem is that,
sorry, Nicholas, I wanted to inject a question here. I mean, that what you've just suggested, I realize is happening. Iran and let's say India exchanging energy in rupees, but that can only go that far, right? I mean, no one really accepts a rupee in international commercial trading. So the de-dollarization, doesn't. How does that jive in your mind?
I would say give them time. Give them time. It's only starting. Actually, it's not happening yet with Iran. It's happening already with the UAE, between India and the UAE. Just give them time. Give them time. Give time to the global South economies to get used to this, to get comfortable on currency risk. Give time to the central banks of those countries to realign their currency holdings, their entire strategy, their visibility, their vision on currency risk, and you will see that this is one part of trade that will keep increasing. I agree that this is not going to be fast. Okay, it's not going to be a quick shift towards non-US currencies. There are counter narratives as we speak. We are in between two rounds of a presidential election in Argentina, and one of the candidates, I think he arrived second, very pro-Trump, pro-Bolsonaro, has proposed, should I be elected, I will suspend the Argentinian central bank and I will re-dollarize Argentina completely. You have counter-narrative in that sense as well. You have some countries that say, no, we should actually do the opposite. We should move back to 100% US dollar. But what I'm seeing is that you have narratives now that did not exist before. You have a dynamic that was not present before. And I think this should alert everyone.
I want to switch a little bit to the Middle East, if I may, Nicolas Michelon. Do you think that the EU has the heft and the relationships in the Middle East to act as an intermediary, a peacemaker between Israel and Hamas?
No. Okay, a longer answer. Let me quote Bismarck, the German Kaiser from the 19th century. He famously said, "Diplomacy without guns is like music without instruments."
Wow.
What kind of diplomacy can we propose to two belligerents in the Middle East today, when there is absolutely no European defense system, or rather there is one, it's called NATO, and we don't control that. It's controlled by the US. When France, for example, is retreating from Africa as a result of the many military coups to depose France-supported presidents, when there is this figure that circulates everywhere in Europe that says that we have enough ammunition to fight a high-intensity war for 5 days. So we better beat Russia at the end of day 5. Because after that, no more bombs, no more ammunition. So what kind of solution can a nation or a group of nations propose when there is no possibility of violence in the discussion, when there is no possibility of coercion? And I would invite our listeners to remember what the US just did. I think it was yesterday. Vice President Kamala Harris was interviewed by an American journalist about the fact that the US is sending 2 aircraft carriers to the East Mediterranean. The US, as a result of the renewed conflict between Israel and Palestine, has about now close to 25% of its fleet in that region. And the journalist asked the Vice President Harris, what message do you want to send to Iran? And her answer was, don't. Simple message.
One
Don't.
word. One word.
Don't even think about it. I would like to propose to our listeners that the longer your sentence is, the least power you have. Europe, Europe makes very long speeches about Israel-Palestine these days. The sentences are very long, many words with many syllables, but that's because there's no muscle behind. When you have the muscle, when you can send 25% of your surface fleet in that region to send a simple message to Iran, stay where you are. It's a different story.
Well, we're starting to run out of time, Nicolas Michelon. But I do want to end by asking you that a lot of us in America and around the world look to the European Union for leadership in so many humanitarian, human expectancy issues, right? The green issues, the energy preservation issues, cultural issues, musical issues. It's a very soft approach to living that a lot of people appreciate. So let's end by my asking you, where should the EU be leading in what's becoming this rather brittle world?
What you've described is unfortunately very true, and I would summarize it as Europe is becoming an open-air museum. So it's nice to visit, but it's not a power that you respect. You respect power, you respect force, the possibility of force, that you respect. Which is why, by the way, China and the US still speak together, because they have the power, they have the force to make the other one respect them. This is not the case of Europe anymore. So yeah, it is a pleasant place to live. It's less and less pleasant, I gotta say, because of the way we are unable to manage our public finances, but because of the way we are unable to control illegal immigration, because of the way we are unable to fight the most radical philosophies or ideologies. I'm talking about radical Islam, but I'm also talking about extreme left, radical left groups. So it's I think it's about time, and I'm not even sure we still have a lot of time. Europe could try and reclaim some sort of leadership on topics like, for example, energy transition, ESG standards. But there is one condition for that, is that we stop expressing these ideals as our new religion. The condition is that we start, for example, implementing energy transition in such a way that is not done to the detriment of the real economy, that is not done at the price of the massive impoverishment of the middle class, which is happening in Europe as we speak. And in that matter, countries like the UAE or Saudi Arabia, for example, are proposing a much more interesting model. And this is, by the way, a model that is being followed more and more throughout the global south. They're also doing energy transition, but they are doing it very gradually. They are giving time to their industries to adapt, to transform, and they are making it very clear that it will never be done at the expense of employment, of wealth for the middle class. They want to continue getting poor people out of poverty, whereas in Europe, we're doing the opposite.
Well, with that, we have to leave our enlightening conversation. Professor Nicolas Michelon, we've run out of time. On behalf of Polaris-Live, let me thank you so very much for taking your time and that timely and instructive conversation. I hope you will come back and see us.
Thank you very much, Sarwar, and I want to thank the entire production team of Polaris. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And with which I want to tell our viewers, thank you for listening to us. It was time for us to take stock of what's happening in the European Union. And of course, there are very few people who can express that better than Nicolas Michelon, who we had on the program today. Please continue to support us, sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Until we see you again on Polaris Live, Goodbye.